the worship of this false god called Baal. So we're gonna kind of get into what happened, and really want to kind of focus on the idea of courage under while you're under different trials, God's power over false gods, and spiritual warfare. So let me give you a little background on who Elijah was, just in case maybe you need to refresh your memory. If you want to turn to 1 Kings chapter 18, that's kind of where we'll be focusing while I go over this. So this is about the 9th century BC under a king called Ahab, which is, God kind of, it's written here, God was more angry with him than any other king of Israel, so he's not the greatest guy either. A couple things had been happening. Because of the Israelites really kind of lost their way, Elijah announced God's punishment to the people, which was a 3-year drought. Now, during this time, there's an interesting little story right before this about him being fed by a widow who's kind of down to her last little bit of provisions in her pantry, oil and flour, and she kind of says, I'm just going to cook my last little bit of food, and then, that'll be it. We'll just die of starvation. And he kind of tells her, this will be like a, never-ending, it'll always miraculously fill up. So he survived the famine with her through that miracle. He also raised her son from the dead. That's in the chapter before what we're going to look at. What we're really going to focus on today is his confrontation with the prophets of Baal, and kind of want to talk a little bit about Baal worship. So this was a Canaanite god. A couple things that it was associated with: storms, rain, fertility, agriculture. And in this sort of pagan system, he had another god. I guess it was a female god named Asherah, and there was all kinds of sort of things that are pretty wild about this, and we're going to look at that. So a lot of it involved like temple prostitution. In the showdown between Elijah and the prophets, they kind of mutilate themselves. So this is some stuff that was pretty extreme. So Baal worship, they built altars. They had, like I said, lots of immoral sexual practices. In Jeremiah 19, you can read about there were human sacrifices, all kinds of sort of frenzied rituals to kind of get Baal to kind of do you favors. So what we're in the middle of here is a big spiritual crisis, a spiritual compromise among the Israelites. And Ahab married Jezebel, who kind of brought in these false gods. And so the people of the nation were trying to kind of, do we follow God or do we follow the queen's system of faith of these false gods? So I guess I want to start off with why do you think the Israelites had kind of have a really strong heritage of seeing what God can do, and all of a sudden they just kind of try to split their energy between the God who's rescued them, and then they've seen all of God's power, delivered them out of Egypt. And so why do you think they kind of did this? And do Christians do this today? What do you think starts people down that road? Of course, they had a leader. It does say that I'll have to dig here, which is hard to do while you're standing up here. A couple chapters before, it kind of says that she brought these false gods with her when Ahab married her. I'm having trouble locating it right here at the moment. But, Roger, say that again. You're saying like they were trying to maintain a separation, or they weren't trying?
They were supposed to maintain separation, but some of them didn't do that. And there was a country or a tribe or something that they were supposed to totally annihilate and didn't. And some of the others were like started intermarrying with them. They accepted their idols.
I know this, I recognize that story. I couldn't say where it is, but I think it really shows, what you're saying there kind of shows that God doesn't tolerate any of that. And here it is showing up. Yeah. You think about this, I guess there's a couple reasons why people may have done this. One would be, okay, there's someone who is in power, and we have to kind of, we think of like we're a nation where we have rights and we have freedoms to do this. I don't know what is under Ahab and Jezebel, if that, that might be a little bit hard for us to kind of think that these people lived under a different system of laws and things like that. So maybe they're kind of afraid of Jezebel's, like, hey, if you don't do this, you're going to be in trouble with me. So maybe doing it just out of like, I'm going to stay out of trouble with the powers that be. Could be a reason. Any other ideas about why? Yeah, go ahead.
I think that it all gets back to the real core, and that is that at whatever junction people decide that they don't want to submit under God's authority, God's plan, God's, express word about things, they start down that road, and we're no different. We separate ourselves by stepping away from God's standard, which basically says, like the Old Testament would say, we want another ruler. We want someone else to rule over us. So they asked for a king.
Right.
We got a king. But God's intent was always that we would be submissive to Him and that we would be reliant on Him and that He would be our leader. And you know what I mean? We didn't need another leader, but our nature always wants us to put ourselves under the lordship of
Earthly things, yeah.
anything else. Usually that's because that something else is telling us what our itching ears want.
Yeah. And that's kind of one of the next thoughts, at least I jotted down. I think in paganism, there's a lot of like quid pro quo where, hey, I'm going to make this sacrifice, and then, you as the God, you're going to like do me favors. We don't really have a faith that kind of works like that. And I think maybe that may have attracted people. Of course, there's a little bit in here about all the sexual practices. That could have been like, hey, this seems like a really interesting thing I could try out instead of, following God's plan for that sort of thing. So there's that. I also think there's probably a lot of at that time, there was probably a lot of societal pressure among some of the people that picked that up. Probably kind of like, hey, are you going to do this Baal thing with us today, or are you going to do the old ways? And so I think there's a lot of different forces that could have caused people to waver between God and Baal. And so I want to kind of flip that around. And are there any, is Baal still around? No, you don't really see like the Church of Baal in Marysville. You don't see like the Church of Baal here or there. But are there any like maybe modern day Baals that people follow? Kind of split their time between, their devotion to God, and then maybe like, oh, here's something I can do this also, which was kind of what we're seeing here in this study today. God's people kind of split themselves between, they were trying to do both systems. What are some modern day Baals? Go ahead, Tim.
I was thinking, Jason, people have a proclivity toward worshiping something. And if they don't worship God, they get involved in other things, some very bizarre things, but other things are kind of just secular, like this whole COVID thing. When we went through that, people got involved and very kept up on what the medical world was saying was safe and what was right, and they carry things to an extreme. And I know, not just here, but a lot of different bodies of believers, people quit coming during that time, and some people, a percentage of them never ever did come back, and so they kind of get led away by causes. It could be Greenpeace, it could be nuclear armament, anything, but they have to jump on some cause or some bandwagon, and they almost worship it to a point like where Christians worship God. So yeah, there's Baals out there. It could be education, could be money, could be beauty, could be fame, any number of things.
Yeah, you got a lot on there. Go ahead, Roger. I saw your hand.
Jezebel was not an Israelite. She was the one that worshipped Baal, and he married and brought her into Israel.
Right.
I knew there was some
Canaanite, I think, if it matters. Yeah, Tim, you kind of went through a long list of possible Baals, whether it be some sort of organized cause, or it could even be something like, I don't know, let's just call it materialism, where we're really into money, success, comfort, and security. Those can become our Baals. Sometimes our Baals can just be the approval of other people. Yeah, go ahead.
What you're talking about is hard for most of us probably here to understand, but like with our kids, social media is big.
Yeah, that is actually written in my next bullet point. I think you're we want that sort of that approval. I did a whole session on distraction with in here and with the young adult groups, where we talked about how the people that design those products are basically monetizing your attention. It's designed to do what it does, and you're kind of playing a rigged game when you get into that. I mean, it's fun, it's nice. I have a lot of family far away, so I get to see what they do, and they can see what we do, and that makes it nice. But it can really overtake your day if you're not careful. And I think I look around in here. There's a lot of people who were born with a birthday that starts with a 19, right? Some of us really don't even grasp how that's really wrapped around our kids. I mean, I spend a lot of my hours with teenagers, and it's a lot. I don't want to spend a huge amount of time on that, but that can definitely be a Baal. And it's not just social media. That's just a vehicle to get the approval and attention of other people. And that can be such a powerful force. But there are a lot of other Baals besides social media. There's false spiritual ideas that look like Christianity, but there's a lot of really new age secular ideas. I think, Tim, you were kind of alluding to a few of these. I don't want to wrap around any particular one, but you'll see a lot of people say I don't go to church, but I believe in God, and it's very easy to kind of split your attention, split your I'm going to use the word worship, split your spiritual life between multiple causes, forces, attractive things that are just like Baal. And so I just want to emphasize that there's a real, I think it took me a long time to figure out, there's like real spiritual warfare happening. And I think before I realized this, I just thought, well, there's just passive forces in the world. Like, sure, you could be tempted by these things. But, Satan is actively trying to split our attention between following God, following God's plan, worshiping God, and the things and anything else. We can sit here and make a really long list of what those Baals are. But I think if you look at spiritual warfare, Satan is going to actively attack things that are standing in his way, whether it's, your involvement here, whether it's your marriage, whether it's, your ministry. Satan is going to try to fill it with doubt, fill it with problems, fill it with temptations, just to get you to kind of say, somebody else will do that. I've done it for many, many quarters. I don't need to teach or be involved. It's not really that big a deal if I go do this thing or if I start incorporating this spiritual practice into my life because, it's very popular and everyone says it works. There's just so many things. There's too many to list in our time here together, but I just want to kind of, emphasize that we're going to see kind of like a true like face-to-face showdown, but it's kind of easy to look at this story and say, well, yeah, that's that Old Testament stuff. It's a really good story. But like, there's a literal war for your soul happening right now all around you. If you don't pay attention to it, you're probably going to lose that war. So I think you have to be very vigilant, very careful about splitting your devotion to God between anything of this world. All right, we're going to move on to the actual showdown here. I'm going to read a little bit of this in 1 Kings 18, and I'm going to skip down to 16. Let's see. All right. When Obadiah went and informed Ahab, the king went to meet Elijah. When Ahab saw Elijah, he said to them, "Is it really you, the one who brings disaster on Israel?" This is the 3-year drought and famine. Elijah replied, "I have not brought disaster on Israel, but you and your father's dynasty have, by abandoning the Lord's commandments and following the Baals. Now send out messenger and assemble all Israel before me at Mount Carmel, as well as the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah, whom Jezebel supports." So we're really kind of throwing down this big challenge here. Invite the whole nation. It's going to be up on the mountain. You bring all your, first of all, he's by himself, and there's 850 prophets here versus him. So this is kind of a big showdown here. Ahab sent messengers to all the Israelites and had the prophets assemble at Mount Carmel. I think the fact that he had to send messengers, it shows that this is wide, far and wide. It's not just one little local cult thing here in the capital. It's everywhere. So Elijah approached all the people and he asked them, "How long are you going to be paralyzed by indecision?" Like, who are you going to follow here? "If the Lord is the true God, then follow him. But if Baal is, follow him." The people did not say a word. Elijah said to them, "I am the only prophet of the Lord who is left, but there are 450 prophets of Baal. Let them bring us 2 bulls. Let them choose one of the bulls for themselves, cut it up into pieces, and place it on the wood. But they must not set it on fire. I'll do the same to the other bull and place it on the wood, but I will not set it on fire. Then you will invoke the name of your God, and I will invoke the name of the Lord. The God who responds with fire will demonstrate that he is the true God." All the people responded, "This is going to be a fair test." So we're in 25. Elijah told the prophets of Baal, "Choose one of the bulls for yourself and go first." It's almost like a duel where it's like, choose your weapon. You bring the 2 pistols and you get the... I kind of see a little bit of that there. I think I like that because it's like there's no funny business. Like, oh, I'm going to rig this so it's going to catch on fire. And go first. You're the majority. Invoke the name of your God, but do not light a fire. So they took the bull as he suggested. They prepare it. They invoke the name of Baal from morning until afternoon, until noon, saying, Baal, answer us. But there was no sound, no answer. They jumped around on the altar they made. At noon, Elijah mocked them. Yell louder. After all, he is a god. He may be deep in thought. Perhaps he stepped out for a moment or has taken a trip. Perhaps he is sleeping and needs to be awakened. So this is some pretty interesting taunting here. So they yelled louder and in accordance with their prescribed rituals, manipulated themselves with swords and spears until their bodies were covered in blood. I don't know. I think there's some imagery there, but sometimes the things that we follow can kind of destroy us and make us look silly. I don't want to spend a lot of time on that, but they get into some really wild stuff here. Throughout the afternoon, there was an ecstatic frenzy, but there was no sound, no answer, and no response. Elijah then told the people, approach me. The people approached him. He repaired the altar of the Lord had been torn down. He took 12 stones corresponding to the number of tribes that descended from Jacob, to whom the Lord had said, Israel will be your new name. With the stones, he constructed an altar for the Lord. I just picture him like working all by himself versus the 400 people. Around the altar, he made a trench long enough to contain 2 seahs of seed. He arranged the wood, cut up the bull, and placed it on the wood. He said, fill 4 jars with water and pour the water on the offering and the wood. So he had done that. Do it again. So they did it again. Do it a third time. They did it a third time. So this thing's pretty much flooded. And it filled like a little trench around it. When it was time for the evening offering, Elijah approached the altar and prayed, O Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, prove today that you are God in Israel and that I am your servant and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, O Lord, answer so these people will know you. O Lord, you are the true God, that you are winning back their allegiance. And here we have the big dramatic ending here. Then fire from the Lord fell from the sky. It consumed the offering, the wood, the stones, the dirt, licked up the water in the trench. When all the people saw this, they threw themselves down with their faces to the ground and said, the Lord is the true God. The Lord is the true God. Elijah told them, seize the prophets of Baal. Don't let even one of them escape. So they seized them. Elijah led them down into the valley and executed them there. Let's see. I'm going to stop there and let's see if we can get into some of this here. So we have this big confrontation here, big showdown. It's pretty dramatic. So I want to kind of look at the spiritual applications here. I think one of the big one is faith. Faith requires us to have a very, very clear choice. You can't be jumping back and forth between things of the world, it's just what I'm going to call all the Baals we talked about, and God. Jesus calls for, one of the things we're looking for is like, where do we see Jesus in these stories? Let me read for you real quick. This is Matthew 6:24. No one can serve 2 masters. Everyone has probably heard this in this room. No one can serve 2 masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. And so we kind of see him talking specifically about money, but we did make a big sort of list of things that could fill that role of Baal. And so when we see Elijah here in the Old Testament, he's really, we see Jesus saying the same message 900 years later. God wants us to exclusively worship him. The Old Testament is full of stories of the people of Israel kind of being torn away and God kind of giving them some spiritual discipline to get them back on track. The other thing is, like, when we divide our faith, when we kind of like split our faith between this and that, it really weakens our spiritual effectiveness. So I don't know. I guess, we talked a little bit about this, but I think it deserves a little bit more attention. Why do you think people struggle with a total commitment to God today? What are some of the big, like, we talked about what these Baals are, but what are the reasons why we choose something less? Yeah, Tim, go ahead.
I'd say number one, it's courage. Because if you step out, and that's, I was going to ask you a question. What do you see a difference between faith and courage? But aside from that, yeah, I think courage is the big thing, because you don't see it very often, and when you do, it's notable. And we'll teach classes about it. Like you're picking this story up because it's so outstanding and refreshing. Just to use a modern day example, I think in the political landscape, there's a lot of things that are being done that take a lot of courage, and we're not used to seeing that be done, and it's being spoken, not in back rooms and not in secret, but it's being broadcast and put out there, and people have clear choices to make. And once upon a time, here not too long ago, people were running around wearing these little gummy bracelets like WWJD,
Yeah.
Jesus do. And that's kind of being proclaimed up today. It's like, well, what would Jesus do in this situation? And therefore, what are you going to do? If this is what your Lord and Master would do, and you're his disciple, you should be willing to do the same thing. But people are struggling with those decisions. So I think courage is the number one reason why people hesitate.
People lacking enough courage to do these things. I didn't. I think that's what you really see from Elijah here. It's 900 to 1. He kind of stacks the deck against himself with the fire, knowing, having the faith that it's going to work anyway. He could have done it one time, and he kind of, they dumped these barrels on the fire, on the altar 3 times. Like, it really does show a lot of courage. And I think, you kind of mentioned, like, I think we need to have what you're talking about there in sort of like the sort of open worldly stuff you're talking about, but I think also having it in sort of our really private one-on-one struggles is important too. Go ahead, Carl. Yeah, I can't really add much to that, Carl. It is kind of, always amazing to me that I wouldn't have to turn back very many pages in the Old Testament to find some other miraculous thing that happened, the things you're talking about. And, I think a lot of people today might say, I might believe in all this stuff, but there's no proof, or it's all just a bunch of fairy tales. And we see people in the Old Testament all the time who lived through this stuff and still fell away or lost their way. I don't know, the point I don't know what point I'm trying to make. I just think it's amazing. I think it's good that God has given us the plan He has. Like here's the Spirit. Here's my written down account of what Jesus went through, I just don't think it's like living under a system where we'd have to have that all the time. That sort of like some sort of miraculous, display like we see here. I think we saw in the Old Testament God did that, and to kind of show His people, and we still had people who fell away from it. Let's see. Let's talk a little bit here about Baal's prophets. So, a lot of times when we get wrapped up into something Baal-ish of the world, we can really get into some extreme things like we see here. They went through this shouting for hours and hours and hours, cut themselves, the frenzied dancing. I think the spiritual application here is we start flirting with these things outside of God's plan, and the false things in the world can demand a lot out of us. And so we see this with these prophets here. This Baal, who wasn't even real, demanded all these things out of these prophets to the point where they were cutting themselves open. And I think a lot of times when you think about it, we've talked about things that our Baals today could be. They demand a lot from us. They demand so much, and they really don't deliver anything at all. Just like Baal didn't deliver any fire, didn't even deliver a puff of smoke to get this thing started, not even just a little flame. All this stuff we pour into these worldly things, we don't get anything of meaning out of them. And I'm not saying you can't have fun, you can't go on vacations, you can't do, but just some of the things we can get tied up into can really, really, really pull so much of what we have here in our short time on earth. It demands so much and takes away so much. And, look back and it's like, man, it didn't even matter. It just didn't even matter. There's just a lot of different things we can do that with in the world today. Now, if you flip that over and follow Jesus' plan for life, you have an eternal reward. You have a more abundant life. Tons and tons of research out there say Christians have, a much more, just better well-being from what they have through their faith. So, we have something genuine, not something that's fake, not something that delivers nothing. We have something that's going to deliver us everything. You think about these prophets of Baal. They go to such extreme lengths to get something out of this like false system. And I think if you see, if you're not careful about this, you can really put a lot into trying to get something out of this false things of the world. And they get to you see them kind of escalate. They start, first they do it a long time, then they do it louder, then I think people who are devoting themselves to things outside faith, they sometimes just keep trying harder and trying harder and trying harder, just like these prophets did. I think there's just a lesson there. And I think sometimes those can even kind of creep into, they can kind of entwine themselves into Christianity in ways if we're not careful and we're not paying attention to the word. Sometimes you think Satan's going to attack you. It's going to be like, oh, I'll recognize this. But sometimes he's going to attack us in very, very, very subtle ways. That's where if you go right back to the beginning where in Genesis it describes Satan, it says he's like more crafty and more subtle. So, a lot of these things that sneak in, it's not going to be like, oh, look, there's an idol they set up here right next to the Walmart. It's not going to look like that. It's not going to be like some weird thing like that. Things can kind of creep in subtle ways, even into our faith. So things like legalism. Legalism is trying to earn God's favor by doing things. And so, there's really not much we can do to earn our salvation. It's already been paid for. So we have to be careful, like things like that can slip into our, our practices. I'm going to just call it mysticism. I think there's a lot of people out there in the world looking for some sort of spiritual experience without really doing the hard work and looking for the truth in the Word. Sometimes we can give up our faith in Jesus, that He's going to meet our needs, for like materialism, where, hey, I have to have this to feel safe. I have to have this to feel security. I got to make sure my bank account's of a certain size, or else I'm not going to, be secure. I'm not saying there's anything. Should we plan for financial things and save money? Absolutely. But when that becomes like our entire focus, some of these things can easily look like acceptable parts of Christianity if we're not careful. I don't know. And did I miss any, or anyone have any thoughts on that before I jump on?
I was thinking how Jesus talked about us disciplining ourselves for the purpose of godliness, because it holds promise for not just this life, like you talked about, a better family, happier, more psychologically stable, all those kinds of things, but it also holds promise for the life to come. Whereas, and he compared it to, this wasn't Jesus' fault, he compared it to people who discipline themselves physically, and they'll exercise, they'll lift weights, they'll eat clean, they'll watch their sleeping schedule and make sure they get the proper amount of sleep, all these things. And, okay, but that's only holds promise for this life. And maybe not even this whole life, because when you get into your 70s and 80s, I don't care what you've been doing, your time's going to take its toll, right? But Jesus said, store up for yourself treasures, in heaven, not upon the earth, where moth and rust destroy, and thief break in the steel. Yeah, all of it is, no matter what it is you're getting involved in here, if it's outside of God, it only holds promise for this while you're here in the flesh.
Right. We were looking at in our life group, like, the difference between like joy and fun and happy. Like I think that's kind of some of the ideas that you're hitting on there. I have till 15:15, right? Is that when we officially adjourn? Help me out. More or less. Well, I got like 60 seconds left. Carl, I'm going to ask you to close in prayer in about whenever I run out of time. I just want to close with a couple things. Very quickly, I just want to hit how simple Elijah's prayer is. It doesn't have, we don't need manipulation. We don't need theatrics. We just need a genuine faith. God hears us when we pray sincerely. And, if you just look at like all the things that the Baal prophets did versus Elijah's, just like, God, I really need you to do this right now to show us who you are. And it's just so simple compared to what they did. And so, we need to remember that. Like, we don't need to manipulate God, make deals with God, or do big theatrical things with God. God, we have a relationship with him, and when we treat him with sincerity, he hears us. We're looking to see Jesus in these Old Testament stories. A couple things. The fire proved God's power. The resurrection does the same thing. It proves Christ's victory over sin. Here we're just conquering these earthly things, right? Jesus conquers sin, death, Satan, and he proves that his resurrection proves that he is the one true God. A couple things I think we ought to close with today as we kind of end this class and then this quarter is be bold. Tim kind of brought up the idea of courage. That's one of the biggest things that we see in this story. The fact that he just went and did it all by himself without any of the theatrical stuff. And he, I think him pouring the water and doing the extra there just showed that he had the courage that God was going to do this. Like, this really isn't about like the laws of nature and how a fire is built. God's just going to do it no matter what. I think another thing we got to watch for is just pray for spiritual discernment for us to kind of figure out what's true and what's false in the world. And, we have the New Testament that tells us how all this worked out with Jesus paying for our sins on the cross and then rising again. And so we see sort of like this ultimate expression of spiritual warfare in the resurrection. It's just a lot in this story. I wish I had more time. I'm already over, more or less. So, I don't know, any final thoughts as we close on Elijah, prophets of Baal, spiritual warfare? I think just leaving you with like, that spiritual warfare is not something that we can afford to ignore. Satan is going to attack you. And, you might be like, I'm really good at this. Satan's not going to attack you at the ways you're good at, okay? He's going to attack you at the things you're really, really, really bad at. He's going to attack you. He's going to attack you in ways that, you least expect it. I'm getting old, and sometimes my students like to challenge me to arm wrestling. And sometimes I win, and sometimes I lose. And there's this one kid, I was like, how about you? He's like, no, because I can beat you in a race, though. And I think that's how Satan is, I might be able to withstand this or that, but he is going to attack you in the things that you are not good at. So be aware, be alert, know that spiritual warfare is real. Any final thoughts before Carl closes us? Go ahead, Tim.
There's this book, and most of you may have heard of it, but Fox's Book of Martyrs.
Yeah.
Many years ago, Reba made a habit of reading one story out of Fox's Book of Martyrs each night before you go to bed. Not the best thing to do before you go to sleep. But it was a book full of courage and people who were definitively taking a stand on what they believed to be true and taking a stand on God's spoken word. And it was encouraging and super challenging, but we can talk about it, classes like this, we can do some mental gymnastics and bounce around, but these people were living it and their lives were really on the line, for stands that they took, and it's still happening in the world today, but not here in America, but it is still happening, and it's like, just because we can't see the spiritual warfare you were talking about doesn't mean it's not going on.
Right.
Satan wants to rob, kill, and destroy.
Yeah, especially as we get more active in the faith, I think the spiritual warfare goes up. Carl?